Masculinity is a podcast for people who have found or are seeking a secular path to recovery from addictions of all kinds. My guest today is Sam Morris, a public speaker, author, and coach. He's a person in long-term recovery and has one of the most inspiring and unique stories that I've ever heard. And a while back, he wrote us, and after learning about our podcast, and offered to appear as a guest. And after I read his story and listened to his TED Talk, I knew he'd be a really interesting guest for this podcast, and I'm excited to have him here today. So welcome, Sam, to Beyond Belief Sobriety. It's good to have you here.
Thank you very much, John. It's great to be here.
So you gave me a really interesting list of topics to discuss for this podcast. All of them would have been fascinating. And a lot of them would have been, none of them really anything that I knew a lot about. But the one that you mentioned that I thought would be interesting for our listeners and for me personally was one on sacred masculinity. But before we get into that, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to our listeners through your story and let us know how you got to where you are today and inspired to do what you're doing today.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my name is Sam Morris. Like you said, I'm a coach, author, speaker, and I also do corporate culture consulting for a consulting organization that I founded. So my story starts in Vermont back in the 70s. And for a very, very long time in my life, I looked at my childhood as amazing and full of love and joy and happiness and laughter and playing a lot of tennis and golf every summer, skiing every winter. We traveled a lot as a family. Things looked really good to me. And they were. Like, that's actually true. Like, that's absolutely true. That was actually an experience that I had as growing up. However, as I got older in life and I started to have sort of repeating patterns and self-sabotaging patterns and, going through addiction and coming out of addiction, all of it became clear that there was something else going on that I didn't really know where the root of it was. I had that confusion that I think a lot of addicts and people that get lost in mental illness feel of like, I know I feel this way. It doesn't make sense to me why I feel this way, but I keep feeling this way, or I feel this way for some people for 15 years straight. Other people, it's for me it was in and out. The addiction was pretty consistent, but the mental illness, the depression, the anxiety, I would come in and out of it in like 3-year phases. And so, as I got to the point where I was like, I need to look at this to really take a look at why this keeps coming up for me. And, and coming out of addiction, the 18 years I spent in addiction, coming out of that was the real kind of window of opportunity for me to look at the first things as what I knew, that I knew I had social anxiety. And that social anxiety goes back to my childhood in that I was very, very sick as a kid. I had a lot, like really, really severe asthma, really, really severe, and a long list of food and environmental allergies. To the point where it made the world seem very threatening and hard for me. So I would avoid birthday parties, Christmas parties, slumber parties, Boy Scout trips, like all the things that kids do to build that tribe and a community with other boys, is that I would avoid those out of fear of, like in Vermont, for example, a lot of birthday parties are in barns. Mm-hmm. Where hay and animal dander and all that stuff is just floating around the air. And so for me, what that meant is like I'm walking into a death trap. Yeah. I knew those were my triggers, my asthmatic and allergenic triggers. And not to mention, if my parents weren't there and I had a piece of cake that had a walnut in it, what's going to happen? I'm going to be out there having an anaphylactic reaction to this walnut, and I'm not going to have anybody there to protect me. So I developed this, like, at first it was just like I was choosing safety, but over time, all that choosing safety really made me a very withdrawn person, withdrawn kid, withdrawn into adulthood, where I really struggled with being social and feeling very uncomfortable in social situations and feeling very like the spotlight's on me kind of thing. And, it all was birthed from that threat or that fear I had of the world. And so when I found alcohol, I found alcohol later in life, mostly because of tennis. Tennis was the number one priority for me, and I was dead set on following Andre Agassi's footsteps onto the Pro Tour, and that was the priority for me. So I didn't really start drinking until I started in college. A few times before college, I really started in college, and then after college, and when my tennis career ended, is when the drinking really picked up. But when I found drinking, it removed that social anxiety for me. And so I learned to love going to football games and going to concerts and going to parties and to bars and doing all the things that you do at the bars. You chase the girls, you tell jokes, you laugh with your buddies. I really learned to enjoy that stuff with the crutch or the lube of alcohol, that social lubricant. Mm-hmm. And so as I kind of progressed through that, I never dealt with that trauma from my childhood. So I had this view that my childhood was amazing, and it was, right. But I also didn't really acknowledge that I went through a lot as a child.
Yeah.
And it started off with, at the day I was born, it started off with my umbilical cord being wrapped around my head and emergency C-section. So I had some birth trauma there. And this is, it's funny, as we do this work, we work our addiction backward a little bit, and we figure out why we're drinking and doing drugs the way we do. And then the more layers of the onion you remove, the further back you go. I've gotten back this far, and even before this, to when I was in my mom's womb. She thought that I was cancer for the first few months of the pregnancy. And so to say that doesn't matter, it would be ignorant of me. And I think it's something that I've really taken a look at, just the energy around that. So I never looked at any of these traumas. I always just operated over them, thinking that, tennis was a Band-Aid, girls were a Band-Aid. There's a lot of Band-Aids in my life. Jobs out of college, these things all kind of put a nice facade on the fact that inside I was at war with myself. And so finally, when I was about 33 years old, the consequences started to show up, and the consequences they were legal. The tangible ones were the legal, the DUI, the drunk in public, maybe falling down and splitting open my elbow, or those kind of things. But also my relationships really started to suffer. My family and I would not get along. I was lying and cheating and stealing and doing all the things. And, girlfriends would come and go because I would basically be a really great boyfriend. And then over time, when I got more comfortable, and my drinking would get in the way, and I would be a not so great boyfriend. And then the girl would leave, and I would get depressed because that meant my Band-Aid was off my bullet hole of, my lack of self-love. So part of the trauma of that childhood, and part of the experience of my childhood, was that with those threats, I had to be super vigilant. And I like to say the difference between being vigilant and being observant, or just being witness, is that vigilance is based in fear, and observance, or just being witness, is compassionate and loving. I was very vigilant. So I was in that basically a fight or flight state for a lot of my childhood, which I never had the opportunity to learn to love myself, to accept myself, to trust my body. I had no trust in my body, so no trust in myself, which manifested, in the physical, but then also the emotional, not able to trust my emotions, my thoughts, my decision-making, all that stuff. Because I always was relying on, for one, I was in that fear state, but I was always also relying on other people to protect me.
Right.
As an 8-year-old kid, when you have an asthma attack at 2 a.m, there's not a lot you can do for yourself. Wow. Your parents will come in and take you to the hospital. And so, but I learned that's kind of the way the world goes. Mm-hmm. So when something's wrong, someone will come save me. And it's not, I didn't consciously say okay, this is how I'm going to operate in life.
Right.
It was just a core belief that got installed because that was all I knew.
Sure.
And so, so from age 33 to 38 was the real kind of dead zone, I guess you could say, of my addiction, where not able to hold a job, no relationships really, 6 DUIs. One time I was 8 nights in jail, multiple trips to the hospital, gave myself oral cancer 2 times from drinking, fell off a balcony one time, 35 feet, and just like complete trail of wreckage for 5 years. And really, if I'm being honest, when I say it was 18 years, it really all started when I was, 21, 22.
Sure.
And so, and that's another thing is like when we think, for me, when I stopped drinking, I asked my family one time, when do you think this all started? And they said 20 years old. And I was like,
Wow.
no. This is, for me, like my impression was that it was like 29, 30. I like, this has only been going on for 3 years. And I was like, I thought that's when the consequences started to show up, right?
Sure.
That's when like I was starting to feel the pain that they had been feeling.
Yeah.
So it's funny now that I've done this work, I can look back and look at like, there's behaviors all the way back into teenage years that would, kind of like predispose this direction. And so for those 5 years, from 33 to 38, it was, bouncing up and down the East Coast from Miami to North Carolina, back to South Florida, back to North Carolina. And then the day it all ended was November 21st of 2012. And, it's one of those spiritual awakenings, moments of clarity. People ask me what happened, and I really can't tell you what happened. I just know that like at that moment, it was 4 a.m. and I was sitting at my kitchen table, didn't have any plan to stop. I had alcohol, I had drugs, I had it all, I was ready to go. But something came over me where it was a combination of fear of the sun coming up and just recognition of all the wreckage that had happened. I was tired, really tired, and just exhausted. And, like I saw my dad's face and I saw my sister's despair, my mom's tears, and I felt it all. And I just said, this cannot go on at all, no matter what. I don't know. I'm scared of life without alcohol. I don't know what dates are going to look like. I don't know what socializing is going to look like, but I know that this cannot continue. And so at that moment, I just decided, I checked myself into a psych ward and then went to rehab for 9 months and then went to San Francisco. And that's kind of when things really shifted for me, because I stopped fighting everything. I stopped fighting and started looking. I started looking at like I knew social anxiety was a thing. And so I handled that first. And then a couple years into sobriety, I ended up depressed again. And it was kind of one of those things, like the social anxiety gets lifted. Okay, we know about that. Like, and then the next one bubbles up, the depression. Next one bubbles up. I like to be saved, like the stories. And then as you get deeper, these things all bubble to the surface and they have to be handled kind of in the order that they show up. And so over the next 6 years, I did a lot of work through AA, through therapy, through the steps. And then after that, I at six and a half years sober, I decided that I need to, like, I was experiencing some of the repetitive pain. Some of the stories kept coming up for me. Like I ended up, I got heartbroken again. A girlfriend had left me after 3 years, which was my typical run. I was good for 3 years, and then I would self-sabotage and then it would just go to hell, and that was it. And then, so I ended up in this place again, and I had a friend ask me, he said, and I said, I was at a men's group, and I said, a men's weekend retreat, and I said, I always end up here. This always happens to me, and I'm terrible at heartbreak. And he said, well, you need to stop asking. you need to stop looking at, like, I always end up here and this always happens to me, but look inside of you and find out the place that keeps allowing this to happen. And that was an eye opener for me. It was like, honestly, I was deep into heartbreak. I was like, I looked him in the eyes and I was like, man, like, kick a man when he's down. But it was exactly what I needed to hear. Yeah. And so it really kicked me into action, to being like, my gosh, he's right. Because I had done some work around like age 35, and I was probably 41 or 2 at this point. So like previously I'd done some stuff like similar to landmark training. It's called gratitude training. And I had done some stuff about how, if it's to be, it's up to me. And like, I'm responsible for the choices I make. And, all these, like the bad things that keep happening in my life, those are all really choices that I've made. And so I started to look at, again, at that time, I was still deep into my addiction and I wasn't really even ready to look at it, but the seed was planted. And so when this guy asked me this question, I was kind of like, I kind of was like, all right, it's time. It's time to really get to the bottom of this stuff. Like, why do I keep ending up at Heartbreak? Like, what about me keeps choosing it? So I got deep into my stories that developed from those core beliefs when I was a kid, deep into like the story of I need to be saved. So I looked back, and like pretty much every relationship that I was ever in, I brought that girl, I called that girl into my life to save me for something. Jobs, I would same
Which
thing.
makes
Like,
total
it would be
sense
like,
with how you were
save me,
conditioned as a child growing up. Makes total sense.
Right. And again, like, so, that's not the conditioning I received as a child, not my responsibility, but it's my responsibility to now look at this and move past it and handle it, because I can't keep showing up and breaking girls' hearts and breaking my heart, breaking my parents' hearts. Like, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep relying on other people to save me. And so, that was a huge turning point for me, was when I just took this massive amount of responsibility for like, okay, I'm willing to go as far back and as deep as I need to go to get to the root of all this stuff. Because really, up until that point, it was treating symptoms. And symptoms are heartbreak, a painful event, a relapse in addiction, a heartbreak, getting fired from a job, your friends getting mad, alienating you or something. Like, these are all these events that we experience are really just symptoms of something more. And what we do is we experience the symptom, the event, and then we have this tendency, or I had this tendency, to work my way back from the event just enough to get good enough. And I always tell my clients, good enough is not good enough. Good enough is good enough to not feel pain anymore, but good enough is not good enough to be clear of the event. Because if you just get good enough, you're going to stop doing the work and you're going to slip back into the danger zone, where you haven't looked at the triggers, you haven't looked at the roots, you haven't looked at the pattern that created that self-sabotaging behavior. So until you can look at the patterns that lead up to these things, nothing much is going to change, because they're deep-rooted patterns. And patterns are strong. So when I got sober at 38, I found personal training was my first introduction into kind of my purpose of healing and helping others. And then that evolved through recovery coaching, and not so much like getting people sober, getting guys sober, but more so like what happens after you get sober. Because a big problem that I experienced was, I'd go to rehab and get out, and then it's like, oh gosh, like I'm sober, but the world is still the same. What do I do? And there was really so I would just kind of like give these guys a soft landing for once they got sober. Like, how do they handle work? How do they handle their families, their kids, their wives? And so then I noticed that all the guys I was working with really suffered from mental illness, depression, anxiety, some sort of trauma. And so I moved from recovery coaching, I kind of broadened my scope into mental health coaching. And then from there, I've evolved into men's work. So I hold men's retreats, and I do one-on-one coaching for men. And basically what I like to say is that I guide men to heal from all the things they're scared to talk about. Because that's really what keeps men sabotaging. And, we talk about, this is kind of going towards sacred masculinity, but one of the hot topics now is toxic masculinity, which I don't agree with. Toxic masculinity is, I think, saying that the man himself is toxic, which is not true. The behaviors that he exhibits are toxic, but what's really going on is that he's a wounded masculine. He has a wound that is showing up as a toxic behavior, whether that's anger, whether that's cheating, whether that's lashing out at people at work. Like, it could be any number of toxic things. Abuse, like all, you can go down the list of toxic behaviors, but really it's because that guy has not talked about all the things that scared him, all the things that he went through as a teenager. Because we as a society in general don't give men the opportunity to say, I got my heart broken when I was 11 and I'm scared of women ever since. There's no place, because if we say that, like if a guy says that to his wife, the ideal situation is she's like, thank you for saying that. I love you. I see your wound. I see your pain. I see your trauma, and I'm here to let you know that's not me. But what happens is the men tend to think that if I tell my wife this, she's going to see me as weak and leave me. If I say something about how, if I'm showing up at work as less than the man I know I can be, if I'm honest about how I feel, my boss is going to look at me as less than an employee, and I'm going to get either a pay cut or fired. Like, we go to this extreme So therefore, what we do is we just operate. We hold it in. We say, all right, that doesn't. My feelings are my feelings, and I'll power through, and I'll man up and just pull myself up my bootstraps, like throw some dirt on it. All the cliches that really have caused men to just harbor all this pain, all this trauma. And I was one of those men for a long time, where it felt really awful for me to say I feel insecure in a relationship because of I feel insecure in the bedroom to my girlfriend, or whatever it may be. I create spaces for men to come and talk about that stuff so that they can go back to their life, their jobs, their families, their girlfriends, their boyfriends, whatever it may be, and show up as the secure, powerful man that their world needs.
Right. Sometimes I wonder if we haven't made as much progress as I think that we would have liked to have made. I remember, getting involved in AA some 33 years ago. I went to a men's group, and sometimes we would talk about, how we were raised, the social conditioning of being a man, and not being able to express vulnerability and love and that sort of thing. But here we are now, some 30 years later, and what I'm noticing anyway is that in society we're beginning to understand gender differently. We're beginning to appreciate differences of what gender means, and as a man, as a white man in particular, as a older white man, sometimes I feel like I'm in the listening mode because I'm the one. I represent the group that has been causing the trouble. You know what I mean? So I wonder if that plays in any way. I mean,
Yeah.
you want to be sensitive to everybody. I mean, every human being has gone through pain, and there's no doubt that you know um, white men have had a privileged role in society and have caused some problems.
Yeah.
But does am I getting off track? Is there anything to what's happening currently with with this aspect of gender and the discussions that we're having in our society today?
Like we said, the white male has been the cause of a lot of damage. However, I think that it's with the Me Too movement and racial inequality, like all these things, it's getting, all of it is getting pushed onto the white men as kind of a generality.
Right.
And I am not saying that there's no responsibility there.
Oh,
There is
sure.
a massive load of responsibility. However, um, it's veering in a little bit to the way of emasculating a little bit.
Hmm.
One of my clients actually, him and his friends talk about the fact that they're basically afraid of their wives, and they feel like they've been emasculated, and so I think that there's a definite. I'm not saying we're there, but I think there's a definite a knee jerk or a movement out of balance with it. It was
Hmm.
out of balance in one direction. I think that
Right.
there's a tendency to maybe move it out of balance in another direction where all white men are threats.
Right.
And so therefore everybody that comes in contact with a white man immediately goes defenses up and basically emasculates the men.
Hmm.
And I think that there's a place that we have to operate where we're taking responsibility, and this gets into sacred masculinity, where we're taking responsibility and we're not perpetrating damage any longer,
Right.
but we're also moving forward knowing that the few that have done the damage are not the majority.
Right. Right.
But I
And
think that go ahead, I'm sorry.
like any social, I don't know if you call it social or not, but like any phenomenon of human behavior, like you said from your own story, is based on how we're conditioned, the way that we're raised, the society that we're living in, and that society changes, and hopefully evolves for the better. And I think that's what's happening now.
Mm-hmm.
But we are a product of our society.
100%. Yeah, I think that there's I think that as humans and as generations, it's kind of an impossible task to keep up with the evolution of the world with the internet and connection. And so like the generations don't evolve as fast as the rest of the world is evolving. So,
Right.
there's a lot of things about the way that men were raised from, World War II time
Mm-hmm.
that have stuck, that were effective
Mm-hmm.
somewhat for a long time. But
Mm-hmm.
now they're not effective, like that, the lack of vulnerability, the lack of feeling your feelings, the lack of saying I love you, the lack of,
Mm-hmm.
that tough guy mentality that was, ingrained, that's gotten really outdated really quickly.
Yeah.
And and so it's hard for, like, as a human race to keep up with the narrative around that. And so
Right.
I think there's a calibration happening, but it's a slower calibration.
It is outdated, and I believe that, and that's what I was working on a long time ago. I'm from the generation that was probably conditioned to where men don't cry.
Mm,
That if I were ever to cry, my father would get angry at me to tell me not to. You know, so to this day, I'm conditioned that if I'm going to feel any kind of emotion like that, I can't even help it. Almost automatically, I shut that down.
hmm
And I know that's a product of my conditioning from my generation and the generation that passed that on to me. It was, if you go back further in time, it's even worse, I'm sure. but
Yeah.
but I don't know where I'm going with that. But it's interesting to take a look at that and to understand how the damage that was done and the healing that
hmm
needs to take place and the changes that I need to make to just be a functioning human being and a good, hopefully a positive, making a positive contribution to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we get onto like that crying or the feeling your feelings, the emotions, stuff like that, it's becoming very, very clear that it is much better to let those out in a safe place. Not so
Yeah.
much. It's not a great idea to walk into a board meeting and start crying,
Right. Right.
but at the same time, like there are places being created. I'm creating places. I have friends that there's like all these places that are being created for men to go and let that emotion out, and safe environments, safe containers where they can go and cry and feel and yell and scream and get angry and
Mm-hmm.
talk about their dads and their moms and the friends that upset them when they were 5. Like, giving them a place for that outlet again, so when they go back to their life, it's not the powder keg inside. It's not the pressure
Mm-hmm.
cooker any longer. The steam has been left out of let out of the pressure cooker.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that this is this is something that people in recovery could look at? Is it something that maybe we're not looking at so much in the recovery community, and that maybe we should pay more attention to?
Yeah, I think that the recovery community, um, it provides it. I think it's tough to say. I believe that there is value to bringing this type of work to men in recovery.
Mm-hmm.
I work with men that are in recovery still, and they, like, it's almost like a men's meeting in AA is
Mm-hmm.
great, but at the same time, it's almost it's very valuable, and I got a lot out of those, and I'm not saying anything bad about them, but
No.
there's a next level to it when you can almost take the rules off, the
Yeah.
rules of AA, like when you can take
Right.
the structure away from it and
Right.
just get really, really raw, like
Right.
really vulnerable, and like the screaming, and like taking a group of guys to a secluded place in the desert and just letting them scream and dance and yell and
Mm-hmm.
beat pillows and do whatever else they need to do,
Mm-hmm.
is very, very, very cathartic. And again, like it's the release that we can't have in an AA meeting, or
Right.
with our families, or even like, once you do the work, once you've been in that place and released and done that healing, it becomes easier to do it in smaller containers, and like in between, like, me and my buddies, we can get real vulnerable with each other. But to have that place where you can go and just really just not care about anything and
Mm-hmm.
just do whatever, like it's not about judgment, or it's not about any of society's things, it's let's real honest, real vulnerable. Let's get crazy. Let's do whatever it takes to like let that poison inside of you out, that trauma, and just heal. And then to have like to do that as a man, to like really let yourself go like that, and then have other men see you and say to you, "I see you. I'm holding you. I hear you. You're not broken."
Okay, good. Your video froze just for a little bit, but that's okay. So, so today you're doing. How do you do your work today? You have a lot of great information on your Facebook page. I saw a lot of videos that you've put out. But basically, what are you doing today? How are you helping people in your role today? What do you do?
So I have 3 different ways that I help guys now. One is I do one-on-one VIP coaching in a 90-day container. So I bring guys in, and it's one-on-one. We talk every couple of weeks, and I give them action items, take them through breath work, just really dive deep into like creating this place for them to come that's safe, where they can talk about all the things that scare them. Like when I say like I'm here to help men heal from all the things, from everything that's ever scared them to talk about. That's it. Like I like that's my purpose, is like I'm here to hold space for men to heal from everything that's ever scared them, because that's really where the healing. Because being scared, that fear, that's what drives anger. That's what drives insecurity. That's what. Yeah. It drives all of it. And so I do the one-on-one coaching. I do a group coaching, which is in a 9-week container, which is called the Conscious Warrior Brotherhood. And that's a pretty set program where I take a group of guys through a 9-week once a week group calls, and we work through like 9 different modules. And then I also offer men's retreats at various locations. So I live in Tulum right now, and so I'm going to be offering a retreat here in Tulum in September. And then I'm also going to work on doing one in the spring. Maybe around something in the ski mountains, maybe Taos or somewhere Big Sky, something like that. But there's going to be, so this is the first year I've offered this. So every year there'll be 5 per year, different locations around maybe Austin, Texas, around the United States, and then probably 2 international retreats that there'll be anywhere from like 25 to 40 guys that just come together, spend 3 or 5 days together, and just have just days of, some days are just super fun, get out in the woods, do adventurous stuff, jump out of helicopters, whatever's on the agenda. And then other days are going to be sitting in a room with 10 other guys and just processing emotions and processing things they're scared of and getting vulnerable and looking other guys in the eyes and saying, "I see you and I hear you and I love you," and really getting that intimate connection with other men.
It's really
so those, and then yeah.
I just find it remarkable that you've been able to do this. I mean, when you think about what you've had to overcome in your own personal recovery, and then to be able to build a community like this and to do this kind of work with other people, it's absolutely remarkable. I think it's pretty amazing.
Thank you.
When I look back at my own recovery, which has been pretty slow and painful, it's pretty incredible. Did you ever imagine, looking back, that you would be experiencing anything like this?
No. I still, like, I've learned to let go of the how.
Yeah.
Like how it's going to look, I think we get wrapped up a lot in, like, I know what I want to do, and this is how I'm going to get there, and there's no other way to do it. And that in itself has caused me, you miss out on things when you, like, I know when I establish my purpose, and like, however that purpose looks, like, I'm totally, like, I didn't even know before January about the retreats and the group coaching. I was doing the one-on-one coaching, but the retreats and the group coaching, like, they just like came to me. I was down here in Mexico, and just, I was able to get really clear on a lot of things. And those 2 things came in and were like, because my ultimate impact is I want to impact 1 billion human beings. And the way I'm going to do that is through impacting these men. Because if I can make these men better, if I can help these men heal, they'll immediately impact probably 5 people, their
Right.
immediate family, wife, kids, maybe mother, father, and then the generations before and the generations back. So, one-on-one coaching is great and it's valuable, and I love doing it. But like, really, like, to get 2 things. One is like, to amplify that impact is to have 15 or 20 guys on a call and be helping them. And that right there, that community that's created is everything. Like, even in AA, the one most valuable thing that I ever got out of AA was the brotherhood, the
I
fellowship.
agree. Yeah.
Like, that was it. Like, I mean, all the other stuff is really great and useful, but the fellowship is it, man. I mean, like, that's the real magic of AA. And so,
It
like,
really is.
I know that, like, and then beyond AA, since I've left AA, like, continuing to like foster those relationships and build and find those communities has been the most impactful thing of my entire life. And it really is something that I just want to bring. I just want to bring these to these men that need it,
Yeah.
because it's really about that. Like, men get so wrapped up in career and family and doing all these things, they lose sight of the connection with other men.
Yeah. You grew beyond the 12 steps, and I find myself doing that as well. I think that for a lot of people in recovery, they might start off in AA or NA or any of the 12-step programs, and some people stay there for a good long time, and they're content with that. Then there are others that are just like, for me personally, I am just amazed at just how huge the recovery community is and all the different options that are available for people in recovery today, and that the 12-step programs are just a tiny piece of it now, a really small
Yeah.
piece of what is actually out there. And what is so cool is people like you and others who are just creating communities on social media or any other platform they can think of that is doing the work of recovery, and not just limiting it to any particular substance, but just recovery in general, from just the damage of
Right.
life itself, so
Exactly.
I just like seeing that. It's just it's a whole new world of recovery out there that I think is just incredible, and I enjoy learning more about it. I mean, it's just phenomenal to me. Every time I turn around, I learn about another group that is starting something else, or another person who is starting another community. It's just
Yeah,
huge. It's huge.
I agree.
So we're fortunate to live in this time to have those kinds of resources.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I always say, like, if we had experienced quarantine 30 years ago without Zoom and without these connections that we have, like, oh my, I can't even imagine. Like, it was kind of like we had built this internet and Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn and Zoom just for this, so that we could actually survive this with some level of sanity.
Was it you who wrote that the quarantine is like rehab for all of us? Or is that something else I read from someone else? I read an
Yeah, I
article.
did.
Was that
No,
you? That's
I
what I
did that.
thought.
I made, yeah, yeah, that was me. Yeah.
Yeah.
As soon as it happened, I recognized, I was like, you know what? Like, we were all behaving like addicts, like over consuming, going at the speed of light around everything, not thinking, no
Yeah.
awareness. And Mother Nature's like, you know what? You guys need a timeout.
Isn't that funny? It's rehab for
Yeah,
the human race. How about that?
totally, man.
Well, I hope it does us some good. Uh, Thank you very much, Sam. I really appreciate you coming on here. It's been a great conversation, and I think that our listeners are going to appreciate this as well. And I look forward to following you and seeing how things progress for you as well. Your Facebook page has a lot of great videos, and I've only sampled a few of them. The TED Talk you gave at the high school, that was excellent. That was really excellent. And your writing is wonderful. When I read the
Thank
story,
you.
your
Thank you
personal
very much.
story was really I found what the thing about it that got me is, there's a lot of talk about trauma going on today, and the role that it plays in addiction. And sometimes we think about trauma as being inflicted on us by some person, and often that's the case. But in your case, it wasn't. In your case, it was your own physical condition. And
Yep.
wow, I thought that was really powerful. So
Thank you.
great
Thank
story.
you very
Thank
much.
you again for coming on. I really do appreciate it.
John, this
So,
has been great. Thank you so much for having me.
all right. And that's it. That's another episode of Beyond Belief Sobriety. thank you for listening. If you'd like to help out our podcast, there's a couple ways you can do that. Head on over to patreon.com/beyondbeliefsobriety and become a patron, or just go to our website, beyondbeliefsobriety.com, and click on the Buy Me a Coffee button or just a donate button. But if you can't do any of that, that's totally okay, because we're going to continue doing these podcasts because I just like doing them so much, so I can talk to people like Sam. Thanks again, Sam. Appreciate it.